Why do so many intelligent people spend hours studying and still fail to improve? They read carefully, they highlight, they take notes, they feel focused. Yet when it's time to perform, explain, or apply what they studied, something breaks. The information feels distant, unstable, out of reach. This is not a motivation problem. It is not a discipline problem. It is not even an intelligence problem. It is a learning mistake. And today we're going to examine the most common mistakes people make about how learning actually works, and why those mistakes prevent real change inside the brain. The first mistake is believing that exposure equals learning. If you see it, hear it, or read it, you assume you've learned it. But exposure only creates familiarity. Familiarity feels like progress because it reduces confusion. When something looks recognizable, your brain processes it more easily, and ease feels like mastery. But ease is not mastery. Ease often just means I've seen this before. There is a difference between recognizing information and being able to produce it. Recognition is passive. Production is active, and the brain changes far more from production. The second mistake is confusing clarity with permanence. You can understand something clearly in the moment, it makes sense. You can nod along. You might even explain it right away. But clarity does not mean your brain has built a durable pathway. Clarity is often a short-term state. The brain can temporarily hold information through chemical activity, but unless that activity is repeated and reinforced, it fades. The mistake is assuming that because something made sense once, it will remain accessible later. That assumption is almost always wrong. The third mistake is avoiding difficulty. Many people design their studying around comfort. They reread notes because it feels smooth. They rewatch explanations because it feels reinforcing. They avoid testing themselves because testing feels uncomfortable, but comfort does not challenge the system, and systems only adapt when challenged. When something feels slightly beyond your current ability, your brain increases its effort. That effort is what signals the brain to invest energy in strengthening connections. If there is no challenge, there is little reason to change. Avoiding difficulty may protect your feelings, but it slows your learning. The fourth mistake is mistaking repetition of input for repetition of output. You might think, I went over this 5 times, but what you actually did was look at it 5 times. Looking is not the same as generating. When you generate, when you try to recall without looking, your brain must reconstruct the pathway. Reconstruction strengthens the pathway. Looking again does not require reconstruction. It only refreshes familiarity, and familiarity disappears quickly without active recall. The fifth mistake is believing that talent determines speed of learning. If something feels hard, people often conclude, I'm not good at this, but difficulty is not a verdict. It is a biological signal. When your brain encounters something challenging, it increases certain chemical signals related to attention and engagement. That heightened engagement makes structural changes more likely. In simple terms, struggle tells the brain, this matters, so if you avoid struggle, you reduce that signal. And if you interpret struggle as incompetence, you may quit too early. Now let us step back and understand what is actually happening inside the brain when you learn properly. When you first encounter something new and focus on it, specific networks become active. This is temporary. It allows you to hold and manipulate the information briefly, but temporary activation is unstable. For change to last, those networks must be activated again and again. Each time you attempt to retrieve or perform, connections between cells strengthen. Repeated activation stabilizes the pathway. Over time, the pathway becomes more efficient. The signal travels with less effort. The task begins to feel automatic. This process takes repetition, not repetition of exposure, repetition of effortful performance. If you look at most common study habits, you can see how they conflict with this process. Highlighting does not require retrieval. Rereading does not require reconstruction. Listening again does not require output. All of these feel productive because they are organized and structured, but they do not stress the system in the way required for durable change. Real learning requires your brain to work without assistance. And that feels slower. It feels messy. It feels uncertain. That is why people avoid it. There is also a subtle mistake that many people never notice. They measure progress by how smooth practice feels. If something feels smoother than before, they assume they are improving. Sometimes that is true, but often smoothness comes from short-term familiarity. You just saw it. Of course it feels easier. True improvement is measured by performance after delay. Can you do it tomorrow? Can you explain it next week? Can you apply it in a new context? Delayed performance is a better measure than immediate comfort. Another common mistake is overloading the brain with too much at once. When you try to learn large amounts of information quickly, you create temporary activation across many networks. But without spacing and repetition, those networks do not stabilize. Spacing learning over time forces the brain to rebuild the pathway repeatedly. That rebuilding strengthens it. Cramming creates intense activation once. Spacing creates repeated reconstruction. And reconstruction is what builds durability. Let's consider everyday life. Imagine someone learning to cook. They watch several recipe videos. They understand the steps, they feel confident. But the first time they cook alone, they hesitate, they forget timing, they second-guess measurements. The difference is simple. Watching did not create enough performance-based repetition. Now compare that to someone who cooks the same dish multiple times. They adjust seasoning, they experiment with heat. They make small errors and correct them. After enough attempts, the process becomes smooth. The second person's brain reorganized through repeated action. The first person's brain only experienced exposure. The same pattern applies to studying languages, playing instruments, solving math problems, or building any skill. The mistake is designing learning around comfort and exposure. The correction is designing learning around effort and retrieval. There is also a psychological shift hidden inside this. If you believe learning is about understanding, you will prioritize explanation. If you believe learning is about structural change, you will prioritize practice. Those are different behaviors. One feels clean and intellectual. The other feels repetitive and imperfect, but only one reliably produces skill. Another belief shift involves how you interpret frustration. If frustration means I'm not capable, you retreat. If frustration means my brain is adapting, you persist. The biology does not change, but your interpretation determines whether you continue long enough for change to occur. Now let's correct the core mistakes clearly. Exposure is not enough. Clarity is not permanence. Comfort is not progress. Input is not output. Difficulty is not incompetence. When you remove these misunderstandings, learning becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. So what does correct learning look like? You encounter new information. You try to explain it without looking. You test yourself, you accept partial recall. You repeat after delay. You increase difficulty gradually. You measure progress by delayed performance, not immediate smoothness. This aligns your behavior with how the brain actually changes. When you do this consistently, something interesting happens. Tasks that once felt overwhelming begin to stabilize. You no longer rely on notes. You no longer need constant reminders. The pathway has been reinforced enough times that it activates reliably. Confidence appears, but confidence is a result. It is not the starting point. It emerges after repeated reconstruction of neural patterns. If you remember only one thing from this video, let it be this. Most learning problems are not ability problems. They are strategy problems. When you align your strategy with how the brain builds durable pathways, progress becomes predictable. Slower than shortcuts promise, but far more reliable. In the next video, we are going to zoom in on something closely related. If repeated behavior stabilizes neural pathways, how do those pathways become automatic? How does repetition turn into something that runs without conscious effort? That is the process behind habits. And understanding habits explains why some behaviors stick while others fade. We'll break that down next.